Welcome back. I'm Joseph Patrick Daniels, and this is part 2 of how to easily draw and shade lips. If you haven't watched part 1 yet, please jump back to the previous video. Again, this exercise is part of a larger course I teach on traditional drawing I've created for beginners, how to draw from beginner to master. It's available online on demand, so if you'd like to watch a preview of the course, just click the link below and it will take you to my site. Okay, I'll jump right back in from where I left off in the previous video. I've switched to a medium charcoal to add the preliminary shading to the cast shadow below the lips next. I'm working around the shading on the bottom lip because it's almost all one flat midtone, aside from those highlights, which create the texture. The bottom lip is about 4th value, and remember, the gray-toned paper we're drawing on is also 4th value. So this shadow's job is to define the shape of the bottom lip. And this way, I've worked in the overall structure of the lips before I attempt to add any highlights. Next, I'll add this shadow that falls across the left side of the lip. Then, step back and see if my subject is starting to take form. Compare the angles of the shadows to your photo reference and make sure they match. You should be starting to see a simple sense of structure and form. Next, I'm going to show you the trick to getting all of this great texture in the lips. First, using my light charcoal, I'm going to apply a coat of very light shading over the entire shape. Just shade right over the area with the highlights. It gradates from about 5th value on the left to 4th on the right, but for now you can just give the entire bottom lip one solid tone. For those of you watching without having seen the first few hours of the course this exercise fits into, some of the terminologies, like when I say 4th or 5th value, may not make sense, as well as the pencil holding positions and shading techniques I'm using. Unfortunately, that would be way too much to explain in the middle of this lecture. So, if you're ready to learn how to draw and want professional training, go to my website, paintersacademy.com, and watch the commercial for the full course. There are even a few lessons and exercises you can try out for free before buying it. At this point, your lips should be loosely blocked in with values. The texture should still be coarse. There should be no detail. But when you step back, you should be able to clearly see a sense of structure and dimension, just from getting those planes shaded in roughly with the right values. This part of the shading process is appropriately called blocking the subject in. Next, I'll choose a blending tool that I'm comfortable with. You could easily use a tortillon, but I'll try a blending stick for this step, and simply begin softening your shading on the bottom lip. There really aren't any gradients to create, so all you have to do here is soften the value and make it look consistent. Soften the cast shadow next. I won't start working on the vignette around it until later. For now, just focus on getting rid of the charcoal pencil texture. Next, move up to the shapes you shaded on the top lip. I'm leaving the darkest tones for last because once that dark value gets on your blending stick, you have to clean it off before working on a lighter one, or it will leave dark smudges in the tones. Notice, by the way, that the line between the lips is the hardest line in the drawing, so be sure to maintain that definition. Okay, great. So now I've softened the charcoal and paper texture out of my shading. This is still part of the blocking in step of the shading process, simply because this shading is still only the basic shapes and planes with no detail or gradients. So next I'll begin to bring in those subtleties. For example, this shadow is surrounded by a gradient that softens out into the plain paper, which is called a vignette. But don't attempt to spread the value of the cast shadow to create that vignette. That will just give you a streaky, inconsistent texture and compromise the shape that's already there. The best way to add that gradient is to add more light shading with a light charcoal pencil around it first, and establish a rough blend. Sorry, my pencil must have had a hard spot on it that left a mark. I'll start over. See those scratches? This pencil has a defect in it. That's not uncommon or a sign of poor quality. That's just a natural occurring issue with the medium. A quick solution is to rub the side of the pencil with the defect on a spare sheet of paper until it gets worked out. Once the basic shape of the shadow is in, I'll soften it into the gray toned paper to create the vignette. I prefer to use a scumbling technique to achieve a smooth transition, but if your shading goes too far, you can always adjust the edges by dabbing at them with a kneaded eraser. Look at the shape of this shadow. See how it bends around that light shape? Be sure to emulate that in your drawing. Again, notice how far back I'm holding my pencil, and using an overhand grip to make sure I'm barely using any pressure at all to add this tone. The weight of the pencil is doing most of the work. And soften it with a blending stick. Okay, great. Now we have the basic structure established and a few vignettes in. I'm going to quickly clean off the tip of my blending stick using a kneaded eraser before moving on. Now that the softer shades and gradients are in, I'm going to manage any edges that need sharpening. In this case, it's just this line between the lips that should be more defined. The edges around lips are naturally soft because it's one type of skin transitioning into another. But where they meet is two objects being pressed together, so there's going to be a hard line every time. Great, that's a good first coat of shading. With that down, I'll begin my second pass of shading on top of it. In this step, I'll begin adjusting and fine-tuning the values and shapes of the shadows. For example, this shadow should be darker and have a more defined shape. Working in layers of shading allows me to build my values up gradually. Next, I want to darken the shadow of the plane on the left side of the top lip using a dark charcoal. This is also an opportunity to start fine-tuning any dark shapes you see in here as well. Now I'll switch to a tortillon to manage the edges and shading I just did. All I want to do here is get rid of any charcoal or paper grain I see while being careful to maintain the edges. And not just the defined lines. I want to manage the soft edges as well. For example, this edge on the bottom of the cast shadow can get a bit softer and more rounded. I'm also transitioning the cast shadow into the vignette a bit more. The more you build and reshape these shadows, the more your drawing will start to take form and begin to feel solid. Next, I'm going to come back into the top lip and add the wrinkles. I'll begin by darkening this plane with a medium charcoal. I'll soften that with a tortillon, but this time I'm going to start bringing in that wrinkle detail, pushing up to add any shadows I see created by the tiny wrinkles in the lip's texture. This shape could be a bit darker. I'm even bringing some of these wrinkles in up above the top lip anywhere I see them. Again, I'm using my tortillon and pushing the darker charcoal into the lighter areas to create this effect. I'm not drawing these on with a charcoal pencil. Okay, next comes my favorite part. Using a detail eraser, I'm going to bring out the light spots to create the glossy texture on the bottom lip and manage the edges a bit more. I know this texture on the bottom lip can seem daunting, so I'm going to show you a trick I use to make it more manageable. First, find the middle of the bottom lip, which again is this little spot we defined right here. That's going to divide the bottom lip in half, which immediately makes it easier because you only need to think about one half at a time. That's why I made sure to mark it earlier in the drawing stage. As you're drawing these dark marks around the center wrinkle, be sure to keep count. I know it looks like a lot at first glance, but there's actually only about 5 of them. Don't make anything up, just draw what you see. Next, I'll examine the right side of the lip and look for any darker cracks. There's one right here. And 2 more next to that. So what I'm doing here is working my way outward from the center, adding the darkest wrinkles I see. I'll move over to the left side of the lip again, but further from the middle. Here's one. Look for its distance from the center mark. It's okay if it's not perfect, just do your best. When it comes to lip texture, you have a lot of wiggle room for mistakes. The shapes are random, so it's very forgiving. Next, I'll soften all of the texture out of those lines using a tortillon. I'll just quickly clean it off before I begin. Notice these creases are only 1 or 2 values darker than the rest of the lips. They're not 10th value, and they don't have hard edges, so they shouldn't feel dominant. More of a subtle suggestion of a shape. Okay, next let's add some texture. Remember, texture lives in the highlights. In this case, the lips are glossy. In a glossy texture, the highlight will generally have a hard edge. So, for this step, using a detail eraser, I'm going to omit the shapes of the highlights. Again, to simplify this process, I'm only going to work on one half at a time. So I'll start in the middle and work my way outward, starting with the right side, one light shape at a time. Notice I'm keeping my left finger pointed at the highlight I'm erasing in my drawing. That's to help me keep track and keep count. I know that sounds challenging, but it's actually not that many shapes. And as I said, each one doesn't have to be perfect. It just needs to be represented in your drawing. If you look closely, you'll notice the shapes I'm making are vaguely similar to the ones in the reference. From close up, it's noticeable, but when you step back, your eye does something interesting. It knows what the texture should look like, so in a way it fools you into thinking that's what you're seeing. It's a visual effect called pareidolia. The reason I'm explaining this concept to you is because artists commonly use this phenomenon to their advantage, and it's an especially powerful tool in creating the illusion of realism. As you can see, I've moved over to the left side, again starting in the middle and working my way over to the left. Don't forget these 2 or 3 shapes over here by themselves. If you have a soft brush handy, this is a good time to use it to brush off any eraser shavings that you can't blow off. Okay, that's enough on the bottom lip. Now I can show you what I mean. Up close, this is an impression of what I see in the photo reference. But when I step back, it looks like detail. In fact, I'd say it's a convincing texture. And I haven't even added the white charcoal yet. There are still a few lines that come in from the top lip that I'd like to add. Again, this is still a good time to manage these edges. In fact, I'll soften this one some more. I'm going to manage this shape a bit more as well. See how it dips in here? And if you don't want to use a detail eraser for this, you could just as easily use a kneaded eraser. Bend it into a shape that works for you and dab at the spot you want to reduce. Next, I want to add this soft shadow in the corner of her mouth. You don't need to add more charcoal to do this. Just use the leftover charcoal on your tortillon and softly brush it out. It comes up here a bit. It's only about a half a value darker than the paper. And there's going to be white charcoal shaded to the left of this spot in a moment, so you don't need much. Then I'll add this dark spot to give it some more contrast and a bit more depth. Okay, before we switch to a white charcoal and begin adding the lighter values, take a moment to stand up, get some perspective, and see if your shapes, values, and gradients match the ones in the reference. This could be softened a bit, but keep in mind there's a light area in here that you don't want to shade over. That value looks correct to me. I also think this shading could be a touch darker, and the texture of my shading is a bit blotchy, so I'll go over it again to give it a smoother tone. Again, these are the adjustments I see in my drawing. Yours may have completely different areas that need your attention. The only way to find them is to take the time to observe your work and compare it to the reference. I think the cast shadow can be darker and more defined. It should match this value in the top lip. I'm using a dark charcoal, and building this value is giving me a more consistent texture in my shading, as well as adding some more contrast to the lips overall. See how it blends into this shadow shape on the lip? There should be an easy flow from one shadow to the next. Nothing should feel stagnant or disconnected at this point in the shading process. Okay, that looks good. Now for the fun part. I'll begin adding the highlights and lighter values using a white charcoal pencil. Make sure it's sharpened because there's a lot of detail in here that you'll need a fine point for. If you've ever tried to add detail to a drawing before and found it challenging, you're in for a pleasant surprise. I think you'll find this step in the process much easier because you've already omitted these shapes from the shading in the lips. So, in a lot of ways, the focused work is already done. Now all you have to do is define them even more. I'll begin above the top lip by adding some light shading. Remember, you want to build this up gradually, so be sure to use light pressure. Notice that a lot of this area is about fourth value, so it should be left plain gray-toned paper. I'm just using a very light hatching motion and an extended underhand grip for this. It's incredible how much the right pencil grip for the job can make shading so much easier. I think this area below the lips needs a lighter value as well. There's even some beneath that where the plane of her chin begins. Later in the course, we'll go into more depth on the various planes in the face when we explore the three most common portrait drawing techniques. As you look closer at the top lip, you'll see there are some fine cracks and detail in there that you can put in if you like. And if you want to take it a step further, you can add even finer detail like the pores. It's up to you whether or not to soften your shading with a blending tool. As I explain in the course, white pencil shading is different than regular charcoal shading. In my opinion, leaving white charcoal unsoftened adds a nice texture to a drawing, giving it a more dynamic look. And once I have a foundation of the broad strokes in, I can add the details and highlights to areas like the rim of the lip. Then, to get the texture of pores, I'll come back into the area with a detail eraser and dab at it to remove some spots. It doesn't have to be much. You don't want something this subtle to stand out. Just a sense of the texture is enough. And finally, I'll add highlights and texture to the bottom lip. Again, start in the middle and work your way over to the left or right to simplify the shapes even more. So, starting at the seam, I'll add one shape at a time, making sure to keep count. And again, these shapes don't need to be perfect. Each one should just be the best representation you can manage, and let the effects of pareidolia do the work for you. If you look closely at what I'm doing, it's only vaguely following the reference image. This shouldn't be a stressful process. Only do as much as you want. Don't worry, it will look good. These speckles taper off towards the corner of the mouth. Now I'll move back to the middle and work my way over to the left. I'm doing my best to keep count, but the shapes I omitted with my detail eraser already look about right. Remember to step back and look for the curvature of the negative space. I can see I went a little too far up here, so I'll adjust it with my light charcoal. Here's what I mean by negative space. Look for this angle and make sure there's enough space between the highlight and the top lip. Then I'll come back in and reshape it with my tortillon. That looks good. Of course, the more you go over it with white charcoal, the brighter and more defined your highlights will get, making her lips look more and more glossy. I love this step in the process, so I can really get into the detail in an area with all these little specks of light. But how far you want to take your drawing towards hyperrealism is up to you. Okay, that looks good. Let's move on to the next set of lips. Please like and subscribe to my YouTube channel for more great tips on traditional drawing and painting techniques. And visit my online art school, the Beginner to Master Art Academy, if you'd like to preview the full course, as well as oil and acrylic painting courses for both beginners and experienced artists. Start your journey today.